Okay, good afternoon, Dad. Or I
Good
guess
afternoon.
good evening for you.
Yeah.
Today is Sunday, April 13th. For anybody that's confused, my dad is house sitting, so he's in my office, and I'm over here visiting the in laws in California. Anyways, let's just jump straight into it. Can we start with the Iran negotiations in Oman? How are those going? Or how did they
Okay.
go, I should
How did
say?
they go? Right. They were held on Saturday. Indirect negotiations in Oman between the Iranian foreign minister and Steve Witkoff, uh, Trump's personal envoy, and they seem to have gone pretty well. You know, the first of all, it was declared upon the conclusion of this first meeting on Saturday that another meeting would be held a week from now. I believe that's going to be in Vienna. So no, that's good. Things didn't fall apart at the start, and I guess at the end of this meeting, as the negotiators were leaving the facility in Oman, that Witkoff and the Iranian foreign minister actually spoke with each other directly, very briefly. I don't think they engaged in any negotiations, but he talked to him. Now, you notice actually there's a contrast. Witkoff never spoke with Hamas, and he actually has spoken with the Iranian foreign minister. And that's significant. So anyway, it's off to a good start, but there's a huge minefield ahead of us. There's really no guarantees whatsoever. I think it's possible. Let's look at some of the past negotiations. In particular, Hamas. That started off with the ceasefire, and again negotiated by Witkoff at the behest of Trump. But Witkoff and Trump did not stick to their own ceasefire. The negotiated ceasefire was supposed to go through two or three phases. The first phase was completed, and then the Israelis tore it up. And they tore it up again after Trump started talking about this great real estate, which was Gaza, and that it would be under American control. This was all in violation of his own ceasefire. So we have, if you look at that, it's not the good start here. Again, we're just talking about one meeting, no substantive agreement. Should not inspire much confidence in us or anybody, as you see what happened to this Gaza ceasefire. Of course, we're not talking about a ceasefire here. We're talking about an agreement on Iran's civilian nuclear program. But I was just thinking about if you look at Trump, we can just briefly look at sort of the behavior of Trump in the various kind of conflicts that he's engaged in. Of course, we have Palestine, but we also have the tariffs, and it, and then another conflict obviously is Yemen. We have if you look at Palestine and you look at at Yemen, it doesn't look good. Trump is really opted for the path of violence in both of those cases. Now, in the case of the tariffs, what he went out with both guns blazing, and he was going to basically shut down the world economy until everybody, begged for mercy. And I guess enough people begged for mercy in his opinion. But then he withdrew. He actually substantially retreated, from his initial tariffs. And I think what happened there was that enough people came to him and said, look, Trump, this is going to be a disaster. The bond market is starting to collapse. Consumer prices of laptops and, these other items that are so important to American consumers, these prices are going to double or triple if you go ahead with this. Your approval ratings are going to go, down to single digits. You got to do something about this. And he did, right? He's retreated significantly, and we could get into the details of that later because there's been a new retreat. But it shows, that tells me that the man is not crazy. He is aware of reality, and when he can see that, let's say the that he's about to, the ship of state that he's captaining is about to strike a reef or something. He does veer away. I think, we've seen that in the case of the tariffs now, but it didn't happen, of course, in Palestine. And I think that the difference is that it's just a weakness, really, of the Palestinians, and not so much of the Yemenis, but still the Yemenis are weak in comparison to, much weaker than Iran. It's highly unlikely, I think, that they'll sink a ship. But it's not impossible. And for that reason, again, the American fleet has actually retreated to the northern part of the Red Sea. But I think they feel like they're safe up at the northern end of the Red Sea. They can bomb Yemen from afar, from Diego Garcia and from the aircraft carriers that are up in the northern end of the Red Sea. They can't really fight back. The Hamas really can't, do any damage to the U.S., but Iran can. The bond markets can. China can. So this is the difference. And it just may be that there is that realism that Trump is capable of. There may be enough people, like we've been saying all along, have been whispering in his ear and telling him, or more than whispering, just, maybe shouting at him. He said, you can't do this. This is going to tank the world economy, may result in a sinking aircraft carrier. This is going to be a disaster. And he may have heard those things. He doesn't really want this to happen. So he may be open for a deal. He may have decided that, okay, yeah, I'll just, after this bluster and all these threats, if I can get something that I can claim as, a good deal, then I'll just say this is a victory. Now, so, that's the positive view. That's the possibility. And I think it really is. The negative view is that he's, again, is surrounded by extreme Zionists. And they are going to put pressure on him. I think, unlike in the case of the tariffs, where I don't think really anybody of note was telling him, you got to stick by this. Maybe there were just a few highly ideological advisors that were telling him this, but the oligarchs, people like Elon Musk, and I'm sure all the other, wealthy businessmen associated with things, hey, this is bad news. This isn't working. And then again, the bond markets were just saying, hey, the dollar is really at risk now. It could collapse on your watch. And he knew what he had to do. He accepted the reality when he came that close to the abyss there, but he drew back when he saw, he peered over. Now, the problem again is that with Iran, you have people telling him, don't do this, right? It's going to be disastrous. But you do have, I think, an equally powerful faction, including within his own administration, that is telling him to do it. And we'll just see. I don't know. It could go either way. It just looks somewhat more hopeful now, but we have a long ways to go. We'll see what happens. There have already been people that have been complaining about Witkoff, about him being too friendly to the Russians, and I'm sure that you're going to have 3 times or 10 times the complaints about him being too friendly to the Iranians. The hatred of the Iranians being what it is in the U.S.
What kind of deal will the Iranians accept? If they really accept any deal, because like we said, the JCPOA was actually a great deal that they hammered out. It took a lot of work, but we just tore it up. Trump is the one that tore it up. So why? Exactly. So what do you think that the Iranians would demand? What would be acceptable for them?
Yeah, well, I think it would just be basically the JCPOA all over again, which they have shown that, they're willing to go down that route. They've done it once, they could do it again. And maybe they just tweak it slightly. I think it was supposed to be good for 10 years. And that was one of the criticisms. And I think it was a criticism that Trump made. And they say, okay, we'll give you 15 years. And, something like that. I'm just, I'm guessing. But I think it, again, they could accept the JCPOA all over again with some very minor modifications. Now, some of the things that Trump was insisting on that obviously were coming from the extreme Zionist camp and from Netanyahu. They said they have to cut all ties, with their allies in the region, with the Houthis, with Hezbollah, and the various militias in Iraq. You'd have to cut all ties, and they would actually have to end and essentially destroy their civilian, or not their civilian, but their own conventional missile program. They're not doing that, again, for the reasons, probably the reason, again, that they do have bargaining strength and they haven't been attacked is because they have this missile program. So they're not going to do that either. But apparently, when they were the Iranians were making that clear ahead of time, hey, we're not even going to talk about that stuff. So it seems like Witkoff respected that, the red lines of the Iranians. And I don't know what they talked about, but the Iranians said that the talks were held in a respectful way, which is, was new. We'll see. Again, Witkoff may get in trouble for doing this, but maybe Trump will back him. He, like he said, he's reckless, he's impulsive, he often, plunges into all kinds of matters without understanding the issues. But he's not crazy. Again, like when he sees, if somebody can make it clear to him that this course is disastrous, he does pull back. And maybe that's what he's doing. Let's just hope so.
Okay. So are you feeling, I just put out a video from our last clip saying that Iran war was incoming, but now you're feeling like it's really toned down that we're...
Yeah. I've never felt certain. Like I think I've said 50-50. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just like there's a serious risk. And I would say there still is a serious risk. I would say it looks, I'm more hopeful than I was, but the danger is, far from past. And, we'll just have to hope for the best. I'm just somewhat more hopeful, but the risk is there. There are these people that are clearly, they've always been there. Netanyahu and people in Trump's own administration that are just dying for, whose life's mission seems to be war with Iran, and they're going to push really, really hard. We know they will, and maybe they won't get what they want. Let's hope so.
Right. So I bet Benjamin Netanyahu feels like this negotiation didn't go the way he wanted to.
Right.
The fact that it came off friendly. Although it seems like Steve Witkoff always says it goes well. I mean, we heard the same thing with the ceasefire deal that he brokered with Hamas, between Hamas and Israel. He said also the same thing, how things were just going swimmingly with Russia and Ukraine. But in reality, we haven't really seen much progress on that. And then the one between Israel and Palestine almost seemed to be a ruse. It never seemed to have any intention of being completed and held up. So I'm skeptical. Yeah. And also there's, like I said, I would be surprised if the Iranians would accept the JCPOA all over again if it was reneged before by the Americans. Like, wouldn't the Iranians, if they do feel like they're in some position of power, to force some concessions from the American side to say, okay, we'll agree to this, but you have to remove these sanctions first? Or could they even put pressure on it to say, you need to put pressure on Israel to stop the war in Gaza? Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, well, I actually am reminded of the Black Sea Initiative, also called the grain deal. That was the idea of it was revived recently by the Americans, and essentially the Americans agreed to the Russians' demands. Now, what the Russians, again, in that deal, it was supposed to be like any treaty, any agreement. It's reciprocal. Both parties are expected to do certain things. And in that the grain deal, the Russians were supposed to receive certain benefits, namely, restrictions were supposed to be lifted on their agricultural bank in particular, was supposed to be reconnected to SWIFT. Let's see, they were supposed to be able to acquire insurance. These various measures were supposed to be put into place so that they could, facilitate grain shipments. That was part of the deal. And it was just never fulfilled. And so this time around, while they respected their side of the deal, which is, it was say, well, this is not much of a deal, of course. One side keeps it, the other side ignores it. So they eventually pulled out of it. And this time when the Americans brought it up again, the Russians said, okay, yeah, we can do this deal, but this time you're going to have to actually carry out those measures ahead of time, first. We have to see them up front. We're not just going to accept a promise. And I imagine the Iranians would do the same, because in the JCPOA, the Americans, even Obama, this was before Trump came into office and tore it up. Obama just completely, he was, the American part of the bargain, or, their responsibilities under this agreement were to lift the sanctions that had been imposed on Iran. And they were very, very severe sanctions under Obama. But they never did. It was actually on the day that the treaty was signed, the Americans imposed new sanctions, and they never took any of the old sanctions off, of any significance. So eventually, and then the Americans tore it up. The Iranians stuck with the deal even a year after it had been torn up and by Trump, and like a couple of years after it was signed, and in spite of all the failure of the American side to meet any of their obligations, and eventually they pulled out. It's very similar to the Russian experience. So I imagine if they go back into it, say, oh yeah, we can do this, but this time you're going to have to lift the sanctions, up front. We won't just accept the promise. I would think so.
Do you think Trump could do that? Like, just politically, is that viable? Because then he'd have to admit that basically it's the same deal that I tore up. I'm the deal maker, and but I have to make concessions on top of it. Yeah, I have to.
It's going to be very hard. You're right. Again, because there is that very, very, very powerful, pro-Israel, anti-Iran lobby in the U.S., which is more, I think even more powerful than the anti-Russian lobby. So it would be tough. Again, I could say he could try to package it in a certain way. Say, because one of his main complaints was that it was only 10 years. Maybe the Iranians could agree to a longer period of time, or something to say now that it's acceptable. But I don't know if any of the Zionists are going to buy that.
I saw something trending on X where, I don't know if this is true, but it was saying that Iran is saying that we want to completely denuclearize Middle East, which means that we're happy to denuclearize completely, but as long as Israel does too, kind of shining the spotlight on them. Mm. I don't even know if that's true, if that's just something that somebody's posted and it's gone viral, but in my mind, that's great. That's a good idea. It's like, yeah, let's be fair. Iran shouldn't have nuclear weapons, but Israel shouldn't have nuclear weapons either. They're the ones that that's going around bashing everybody constantly, and they have these nukes. So do you think that's something that Iran could try to stick to their guns? And is it possible that Iran may try to push this further because they know that they kind of do have a position of power, and if they do want to bring down the American empire, we've talked about this before, it's war with Iran will bring it down. Of course, could be horrific for Iran as well, but it's just something I'm thinking.
Yeah, well, I mean, it certainly would be fair, but the Israelis are never going to do that in a million years, and their backers, they're very, very powerful backers in the U.S. would never allow that to happen. But they could certainly, it would shine a light on this fact. There's probably a lot of people that aren't aware of it, and I think that would be would have that benefit, a benefit of enlightening a certain portion of the public.
Right. It would just further to show the hypocrisy of everything that Israel is doing, which I think would be greatly beneficial. It could help bring down the Zionist regime there. But I'm also just afraid, like you said, Benjamin Netanyahu, this is his lifelong dream, his work, what he's been working for so long. He's in the middle of this war. He's got all these legal cases against him. There's internal strife within Israel. This is his one shot. Once this is over, I mean, once the Gaza thing ends, whether or not they withdraw and they attempt to rebuild, or they just completely ethnically cleanse it, like this is it. It's not. I feel like it's not stopping. This is his one shot. So, like, what could he do to potentially derail it? Do you think it's possible that Israel could just carry out an attack on their own, and then the U.S. would be really mad? And, Trump would be like, "Hey, what are you doing?" But Netanyahu knows no matter what, once Israel starts getting hit, the U.S. will be sucked into it no matter what.
Well, it's not impossible. It's certainly possible. Yeah, I could see that happening. It hasn't happened so far. They for whatever reason, it's not a risk that Netanyahu has been willing to take. But who knows? In these in the current circumstances, with his back against the wall for the various reasons that you just gave, he conceivably could do that. But of course, he just has a lot of very powerful backers, again, like the number one donor to the Trump campaign, who I think would be on his side on this. We need to attack Iran. I'm talking about Miriam Adelson, of course.
Yeah, and I don't want this to happen, but almost part of me doesn't want these negotiations to work, but because I just want to see what's happening in Gaza to stop. And I feel like the only way it's going to stop is if Iran does something about it, because they seem to be the only power there that is on the side of the Palestinians, that has the ability to stop it. Yemen is, it's very brave what they're doing, but they can't stop the genocide. They can just be a nuisance. But I shouldn't want that. I know an all-out war will be so much more destructive, and we might see Gaza times 100 spread throughout everywhere. But if they do get this negotiated deal and Iran denuclearizes, does that mean that there's just no hope for the people of Gaza and Palestine? That, sorry, we struck this deal, you guys got to tough it out. That's almost what I feel like. That's almost the more important thing to me, and I think a lot of the world, about this deal, is they want to see somebody stop Israel doing what it's doing.
Well, Iran has made it clear, like I said, that their relationship with these various groups, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis, is off the table. That's not something that they're going to give up on. So in other words, their support for the axis of resistance is non-negotiable. They're going to keep that. So nothing changes there. And when we say denuclearize, well, they don't have a nuclear weapon. They would just pull back, from the 60% enrichment and, reduce the amount of nuclear material that they have in the country at any one time. That's what the JCPOA did. They just very severely restricted the amount of fissile material under the control of Iran at any one time to make it impossible for them to break out into, to develop a nuclear weapon. But it doesn't do anything to affect their conventional support for the axis of resistance. The truth is, it's a horrible, gut-wrenching truth, but I don't think that anybody can save the Palestinians other than really the United States. Iran can make Israel pay a cost for its support, but I don't think it can actually stop them. And if a war broke out between Iran and Israel might just use that as a cover to really to complete the genocide or the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. That's a horrible truth. The one country that really could stop it, again, is the United States, because Israel cannot go forward. It really couldn't survive another week or month without the support of the U.S. And
why is it only the United States? Why isn't it other countries that could put pressure or sanction? If China, for example, stopped shipments to Israel, wouldn't that be crippling to them? Couldn't that put a lot of pressure and say, we're just asking, it's not saying just stop bombing these people, right. It's not, we shouldn't even have to ask, right.
Yeah, well, especially I think a country that could do something and it really is obligated to do something is Turkey. They claim to be a Muslim country. Their brothers are being killed. Practically next door, are being. We know, subjected to these horrors. They're being subjected to a genocide, and yet the government of Turkey does nothing. It's all business as usual. It's a lot of talk, but it's no action whatsoever. That's a country that could apply pressure. So there are a number of countries that could, if there was a growing. You're right. If there was some sort of growing boycott, of Israeli goods all around the world, that would put a lot of pressure on Israel. But even so, as long as they have the U.S. there, I think there would be this tremendous outcry, about anti-Semitism has just become this horrible cancer that has gripped the whole world, and we Americans have to prevent this and fight it. And then, instead of giving the Israelis, whatever it is now, five, with the recent military packages, it's much more than the $3 or $4 billion that they get every year, the many, many billions of dollars that Israel receives every year. We'll double that, make sure that they can keep on going and fight those evil people that are trying to destroy them.
Well, that's pretty depressing. So you think that this Gaza horror show is just going to continue, drag out?
Yeah, it's so terrible right now. I mean, we haven't talked about it much, and the world really hasn't paid very much attention to it. Not as much as they did during the first year. But things aren't getting any better. They're only getting worse. I mean, and the horrors are never ending. And we've just become numb to them, I'll give you an example. I think if you remember in the first month of the war, back in October of 2023, there was a missile that struck a hospital in Gaza. And there was a great controversy over that. The Israelis were claiming that somehow this had been fired by Hamas or maybe Islamic Jihad from the parking lot and it had gone the wrong way or whatever. There was, and they fought it, and there was a great debate, online that was waged in the media and online, and that same hospital was actually just struck, I think it was yesterday, by two missiles. One that took out a surgical ward, the other that took out the oxygen supply plant of the hospital. It just rendered it almost completely inoperable. And there's no comment about it. The Israelis didn't even bother this time to come up with a story and try to fight it. It just shows that within this year and a half that this war has been fought, we are witnessing a descent into barbarism, something not just within Israel, but, among all of Israel's supporters, all those people, all those media organizations, those journalists, those politicians that are complicit. It felt like, once they had some sort of conscience, or at least they needed to keep up this appearance of a concern, for human lives, other than Israeli lives. And now they don't even bother. I mean, this is what we're seeing. And Israel, Gaza is becoming uninhabitable. The Israelis are destroying, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago, and maybe it was a month ago, that they destroyed a water pipeline that supplied 70% of the drinking water in Gaza. That is still inoperable. And when the Gazans themselves tried to repair it, they were attacked by the Israelis. And that's just, a thing, no food, no water, no hospitals, all the homes, some of the homes that were, have been repaired, have been destroyed again. I think it was just yesterday, a family of like 12 had moved back into a house that they had repaired. It had been attacked early, and then it was destroyed again, and everybody was killed. The grandparents, everyone. And there's actually so much that you don't even know what to say, and it is a genocide. It's happening, and it's not slowing down. As the Israelis are very systematically destroying all those things that make life possible in Gaza, and they are more than that. They're taking territory. They've created these so-called buffer zones, along the border with Israel, and they just created a very large one, really encompassing all of Rafah in the south. So now 25%, and then we also have, what is it called, the Yahatzin corridor. It's something that runs pretty much right through the center of Gaza, and bisects it, pretty much cuts it in half. They've taken that too. So Gaza is being eaten up and, carved into pieces. And I think we can expect that probably they are never going to remove themselves from that. So you have, they've already taken 1/4 of Gaza, declared these areas to be military zones, for Israeli military only. And then, they're attacking, the remaining 3/4 and have told informed the Gazans, that this is a free fire zone, you have to evacuate immediately from that zone. And the end result is that only 1/3 of the land is supposed to be safe, but it's not even. But that's not safe. They tell you go to this place. This is a sanctuary area, and they attack that. I mean, these people are not going to survive. I mean, if this continues, and I think it's all obviously all very deliberate, and it is part. Now they're talking. It was the sort of thing that they couldn't talk about openly. At least in English. Maybe they said it in Hebrew among themselves, but now openly saying, it's basically you die or you leave. And now, if you want to leave, we have places we can send you. And this is what's happening. And there's just nobody that really can stop it again, other than the Americans. And the Americans have no interest in doing it, apparently.
I just can't believe that this is happening. It's been happening for so long, and it's not going to be stopped by anybody. I'm just waiting. Every day I'm just waiting, like somebody's going to stop it. Someone's going to step up. Iran's going to step up. Maybe the Egyptians will rise up. Maybe we'll see the Jordanians. These stories that you tell me, these are happening. I see them on X as well. What you told me about like the family that moved in, that prepared the house and just collapsed. It's like, that's just a microcosm. Yeah. I'm seeing horror stories like this every day on X, and it's painful. It's really painful to watch, and I think so many people are seeing it. I just can't believe that we're not doing anything. Like I said, this is 2025. We have all this information at our fingertips, and people you watch it on your phone, and then you just go on with your day. It's strange to me that I can see such horrors every day on my phone, and then I just go to the grocery store and go about my life. And it's affecting me. I know, because sometimes I have trouble sleeping when I see some of these videos at night. I just can't believe that you think that it's possible that this is just going to happen. That it's just, it is happening, but that,
yeah, it is happening.
We're not going to see somebody step up. Like, surely somebody will. How could we watch a genocide unfold before our eyes? And I just wonder how we're going to all live with ourselves. Yeah, we are. Yeah, but right. What can, I just feel like I'm surprised the Middle East hasn't risen up. Sometimes I feel kind of like, I want to do something, but there's very little we can do. And
right. Of course, there are certain groups that have, of course, the Houthis, but Hezbollah did too. And they suffered. They paid a huge price for that. Remember, they fired those rockets into northern Israel, and they did that continuously, and said, "Well, we'll stop when you have, achieve a ceasefire." It's the same thing that the Houthis did, but they ended up paying a terrible price for that. So there are groups within the Middle East that really have stepped up, and we have to point to the axis of resistance. Now, again, Iran has done its part by through its support of these actors like the Houthis and Hezbollah, but there's really not a whole lot more than they can do that they can do than what they've already done. It seems like the countries that I would look at, you talk about, you feel this rage. Well, it's clear, there are a lot of people in the Middle East, a lot of Arabs, a lot of Muslims that are feeling, and there's this growing rage and sense of despair and disgust with their own rulers. I think there's no question that out on the street, there is the sentiment, is against Israel and in support of, Hamas and the Houthis and these other groups is growing by the day, but they don't have power. They're overlords, their governments. We talk about the Persian Gulf monarchies or Saudi Arabia or Erdogan's Turkey. These are corrupt regimes that, they understand the anger of their people, so they're careful what they say, but they're self-interested. They have a cozy relationship with the West in general, and often with Israel in particular. Now, this may be, say a pot that just might boil over. I mean, the anger might be such that at some point, again, these different governments might be overthrown, and then maybe we could see real action again in places like Egypt. Egypt is very large; it's very poor, but it's very large. We're talking about like 100 million people. Jordan is very poor and very small, so I don't know what it can do. Turkey again is a major country and a real military power too. And they're probably the most powerful outside of the U.S. They are the most powerful military within NATO, and they have a population of about 95 million people. So if again, Turkey is a country that could do something about it, especially in coordination with other countries, could put real pressure, military pressure, economic pressure on Israel. Again, I don't even know if that would succeed because, again, you have the United States on the other side, but it would be something. And there is that anger. So the problem is these corrupt governments that are just too cozy with the West.
So what should we hope for? Some one of these corrupt leaders in the Middle East to be overthrown, and then somebody come in and attack Israel, and then should we hope for an all-out Middle East war? I mean, like, there's no good answers, right?
I know there's no good. I just don't see this ending well in any case. I don't see a happy ending to this at all. If there's a happy ending, it's way, way in the future. Or there will not be a happy ending to this. I'm afraid to say. I don't see how it could be.
It's frustrating because, like you said, the one power that can do something and do something so easily, and I think that it would be a popular move, would be for the United States to end aid. And it's just something that I think could align so well with Trump in his America First, platform that he built on. Saying like, okay, we got to protect our own country, our own interests. We have lots of problems here. We're massively in debt. We can't be sending all this money in overseas. And it's just crazy how everything's flipped so quickly.
Right. Well, again, it's like we pointed out many times, again, the ground is shifting under the feet of these different governments, including the U.S. government. Right. That recent poll, I think you mentioned that, more than half of Americans actually, what was the language, disapprove or have a negative view of Israel. Right. But interestingly, it's mostly on the left, but it's not entirely so. That among young Republican leading voters, and we're talking about young, it's like 18 through 50 or something. Or 18 through 45, something like that. So, we're actually, it's a broad range. I think it goes, well into middle age. Now 50% of them 50% of this group have a negative view of Israel. Now, again, this is huge. And this is, I think it does portend the end of Zionism. Again, Zionism is only possible because of this unconditional American support. And you have to look at those figures and say, oh, this isn't going to last forever. It may not last for even more, I think the only thing that we can really hope for is a real change, is some sort of political revolution within the U.S. I think it's going to come eventually. It just may come too late for Gaza. That's what I'll say. I know.
I'm just thinking, was Israel? What if they get away with it? What if they do? Can they get away with it? If they end up exterminating virtually everybody in Gaza and taking over Gaza, then a year later, it's like, oh, that was in the past. We forgot about it. It's out of the news cycle. We don't see it. I don't think so. We've had these images seared into our minds now. It's getting more and more horrifying. At least for me, what I'm seeing now coming out of Gaza seems to be somehow. I mean, I saw some horrible stuff before, but it just seems to be picking up, and more people are becoming aware of it. And I think more and more people are becoming aware that Trump is captured by the Zionists. I talked about that Joe Rogan interview between a debate between Dave Smith and Douglas Murray, and how Dave Smith just eviscerated Douglas Murray, and it was beautiful to see. I'm so glad that so many people got to see that and kind of understand, what's going on there. But the next day after that interview, or after that debate, Trump tweeted something on True Social saying like how great Douglas Murray is, and buy his book on basically justifying everything that's going on there, and how this is defending Western civilization. And it just seemed like, his Zionist handler said, uh-oh, this was a blow to our image. Send out this tweet, Mr. President, to protect Israel and Douglas Murray. It just felt like, we get we're so hyper-partisan in the United States. Everyone gets so geared up for every election. But at the end of the day, you vote for Israel. That's what apparently is what it is. You get Biden, you get Trump. It's all, at the end of the day, you pull off the mask. It's Benjamin Netanyahu behind it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's essentially true. Again, the only thing positive thing we can say, hopeful thing we can say is that more and more people, many more people now see that, and that's what, the polls are telling us. So it's not going to be forever. But again, I'll just say, I think it might be too late for Gaza.
What about the West Bank? It's also getting bad there too, and people don't see it. Do you think that they will be able to? I mean, what does Israel think that if they take the West Bank completely, and they completely, either exterminate or exile them, ethnically cleanse the land in Gaza and the West Bank, that people will just accept it, that this is now this new Israeli state, that they achieved their dream? But who knows if they're going to stop there, right? They've taken parts of southern Lebanon. They've taken parts of southern Syria. It has to stop at some point. They can't just keep on killing people and taking their land, right?
Yeah, you certainly would hope so. I mean, it's, I think it's important to talk about the West Bank. We don't talk about it nearly enough. In fact, if it wasn't for the horrors of Gaza, I think everybody would be talking about the West Bank, because they certainly, the Israeli violence in the West Bank, the settler violence in particular, but, also just direct IDF violence has increased markedly since October 7th. And in fact, there have been more West Bank residents that have become refugees, within their own little piece of land, which is the West Bank, than since 1967. And so it's, the amount of violence, the amount of destruction there is enormous. Again, it just pales in comparison to Gaza, so we don't notice it. But if Gaza didn't happen, West Bank would be in the news all the time. This huge upsurge in violence, what are the Israelis doing? But it's just become, like Gaza's become the new normal, and the West Bank, by comparison, is a peaceful backwater. But it's not peaceful. It's I think clearly, there's been this ongoing process of really slow motion ethnic cleansing that dates all the way back to like 1968, soon after the 1967 war. It's accelerated in the West Bank, and the rumors are that Trump promised Miriam Adelson that he would support, or may directly declare that West Bank was part, of Israel. That, like what he did with the Golan Heights. He would support an outright annexation of the West Bank. And I think there's a very good chance we're going to see that. I was just reading a Haaretz article yesterday. The journalist, I made the very good point that we're seeing kind of, as what, it was not just herself, but many, many people have said, well, we're kind of seeing that the West Bank is being subjected to the Gaza treatment. It's not on the same scale, not nearly the same scale, but there are just entire neighborhoods and villages that are just being turned into rubble, in a way that you didn't see before. The advances were much more incremental before. So you're seeing the Gaza treatment for the West Bank, but then you're also seeing, and this is what I think she made her original point, was that you're seeing the West Bank treatment of Gaza. And I alluded to that earlier. It's just one thing that Gaza had going for it, before October 7th, was that, okay, yeah, it's kind of an open air concentration camp, no question about it. But, within this concentration camp, within this sliver of land, you're free to move around and socialize with who you want and, go visit your cousin at the other end of the Gaza Strip. And in the West Bank, for a long time, that has been next to impossible because, as you know, the West Bank has been just sort of cut up into a lot of different pieces. And there are checkpoints and, just everywhere. And so if you want to go for one part of the West Bank and you're a Palestinian, if you're an Israeli, it's different. There's special, roads for Israelis, who they can travel freely where they want to, even within the West Bank. But the Palestinians themselves have just hope that that they can get through. You want to visit your cousin in another part of the West Bank. Well, you get to that first security point. The guy has harassed you for a long time. You maybe humiliate you in different ways, but they finally let you through. You get to the second one, and it's shut down, and you got to go back. You spend the whole day. This is daily life for them. And now we're seeing that happen, like I was saying, within Gaza. Before Gaza was, it suffered terribly, for prior to October 7th. Again, it was an open air concentration camp, but within that concentration camp, you can move around and, and do what you want with your friends and so forth. Now that's changing. As I was saying, it's been bisected. They've taken all of Rafah and, they're creating these different zones the way they have in the West Bank and making it increasingly impossible for, the Gazans to move around. And I think this is permanent. I think this is the plan, that we're gonna see the West Bank. It's already so densely populated, but that dense population, or what remains of it, is going to be forced in ever smaller bits of land, and with the a concomitant loss of freedom. That's what we're going to see.
In our last episode we did, or actually this was even further back, but we talked about just how so many people, especially young men, try to find a sense of purpose, and sometimes that purpose can be manipulated, and they get drawn into the glory of war, and they sign up to become mercenaries to fight for Ukraine, or mercenaries to fight for Russia, and they don't really fully maybe understand the conflict that well, but they want to do something important with their life. They want to be part of something greater. And so we see a lot of that. We see a lot of mercenaries going to Ukraine. We see mercenaries go on the Russian side as well. And then I'm just wondering why, what's happening in Gaza, nobody is kind of signing up to fight for the Gazans, to help them. I know they don't have an army. There isn't a recruitment office or anything like this. But if you're looking for purpose, I feel like, and you have that desire, it's like this is sort of the moral, a real moral thing to fight for, I feel like, is for the lives of these civilians, because you are protecting a civilian population. You see so many women and children just getting massacred. You think that there would be some way to couldn't there be something within Egypt or somewhere else where that people can sign up to fight back, to say like this has to stop. We have to end this bloodshed, make the cost high for the Israelis too, so that they will just say like, we can't do this anymore. Yeah. Like, well, why is that possible? Like, well, are we just going to sit down and watch it?
Yeah. Well, again, of course, the Houthis and Hezbollah, they did. I think there was, what they did was entirely moral. Just unambiguously moral. And what the Houthis are still doing. Now, like in the case of the Egyptians, I'm sure you would get many, many volunteers, to help their brothers in Gaza. Unfortunately, I just don't. I think the problem is, first of all, the Egyptian government is deliberately suppressing those kind of movements and preventing volunteers from moving into Gaza, even if it were possible. At this point, it's not even possible. Again, I've told you, they've taken the idea of taking the Philadelphia corridor. Again, I think actually they have, in breach of the treaty that they had made with Egypt after the Camp David Accords, decades ago, and then all of Rafah. And so it's just not even possible for volunteers to, I don't know how possible it was before. I think it might have been very, very difficult for it to happen before, but now it's just not even possible.
All right. Well, it's really depressing.
It is. It is. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to talk as well about the trade war and what's happening with China, maybe some updates with the Russia-Ukraine war, but it just feels almost strange to talk about it now after just such
Yeah.
a horrible, horrific
I
thing
think
that's
it's, yeah, it
happening.
is awful, but I think, yeah, we have to talk about it. Maybe not every time, but we have to talk about it. We can't forget what's going on there.
No, for sure. Yeah, no, I
And
think
again,
this is
it's like
it.
we haven't even begun to, I've spared the viewers the real graphic details of what's happening. I mean, you occasionally mention a little something, but it's just every day. I mean, if you want to go and see it, you can see it. It's just beyond belief. I mean, horrible beyond belief.
Yeah, it really is, and it's just I still can't believe that we're just letting it happen. That it's just going to happen. We're going to sit by the whole world, just going to sit by. No government in the world except for Yemen is standing up and doing something.
Yeah.
I mean, we hear some, we get some condolences from some leaders and some hand wringing, but no action. I
Yeah.
mean, Iran, support for the Houthis, great.
Yeah, well, I
Yeah,
mean,
it's
actually, it's just Iran has taken real risks for them. I mean, they probably wouldn't be subjected to these threats now if they weren't supporting the axis of resistance. And that's one of the main reasons for the ire that's directed against them and the motivations for an attack on them. So Iran has, they put their neck out. They you know, I don't think you can criticize them. Again, I would say, again, it is a responsibility of these people here. It's of Muslims, of Middle Easterners themselves, above all. I mean, that's just the nature of things. It's like you should be standing up for your brother, right? Now, like for the Russians, they're involved in an existential struggle themselves, and yeah, they have supported, in general, like Iran. I mean, I think like one reason that Iran is confident that it could withstand an attack is because Russia's there, and both Russia and China has Iran's back. They are playing their role. Maybe I think probably they should do even more, but it is a responsibility of those countries there, and and we pointed to those few countries that really have, behaved in a moral way, and many of those governments have not.
yeah. Okay. Well, I guess we'll just have to watch and see. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe we can talk about the trade war and Russia Ukraine on the next episode, Dad.
Sure.
Yeah, I feel like we will just
Yeah, I
leave it
kind of
with
know what you
Gaza.
mean. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
it
know.
just doesn't feel right for me to just switch and be like, well, iPhones are gonna be a little bit cheaper. It just doesn't,
Yeah, yeah.
after all this.
Right.
Okay, well, I'll let you know for the next episode on Wednesday. I'm going to be going up to see Grandma, your mom.
Hmm.
So we might need to work around that schedule, but I'll let you know. So we'll have some flexibility for the next 10 days until I get back home.
Okay.
Okay, Dad. Thanks a lot. Thanks for watching the house for me. And
Yeah.
yeah, I'll talk to you before too long. Okay.
All right.
All right. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay. You too.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.